For coming to this PhD Masterclass. My name is Ronan Cormacan, for those who haven't been here before. I'm very pleased indeed that Dr. John Stanton-ife has agreed to give our Masterclass today, and it will be on constructing a thesis. John lectured me many years ago at Queen's University in Belfast, and he now lectures at King's College. And without any further ado, I'll hand you over to John. I should just say, for anyone who hasn't been here before, it's designed as an informal workshop, so anyone who has any questions, I'm sure John won't mind if we interrupt him with questions at any point in his talk.
Yes. Thanks very much, Ronan. Yes, can I reiterate that? It is very informal, and I'm very happy to be interrupted. So please have no compunction about doing that. Well, thank you very much, Ronan, for the invitation, and to you all. I've been asked to talk about the idea of structuring a thesis, which in some ways is quite difficult to do in the abstract, since each separate thesis is going to be something that will take on a life of its own, and so it's what may work for one thesis is not necessarily going to work for others. But I have got the impression from a few years in which I've been involved with the supervision of some PhD projects, and in the examination of some of these projects, that there are some quite general principles, probably plural principles, maybe stretching it. And there's one simple thought that's often struck me as I'm supervising and as I'm reading a thesis for the sake of a thesis defense. I'm often thinking, well, there's one very simple thought here, which probably can't be reiterated too often. And so I'm going to be doing a fair bit of reiteration of that point today. Now, well, my area is in law. I work in criminal law, and mainly in the interface between the philosophy of law and criminal law. So it's a quite flourishing brand of research. A lot of it goes on in the USA, which combines philosophy and substantive criminal law in the common law world. So that's mainly the sort of stuff that I'm involved with. Okay. Now, last year when Ronan asked me to come here, he sent me a long list of questions, saying these are some of the things that you might want to address, and they're very helpful. I'll read you out these questions, and what I'm going to be suggesting is that the answer, more or less, the answer to the first question, the first of Ronan's questions, is the answer to all of the others as well. One or two little modifications to that. But so, first question that Ronan sent me was this: how do you determine the structure of a thesis? That was question one. Okay, and then there are about another 7 or 8 questions that follow them. Okay, where should you put your own thoughts and where the thoughts of others? Then, how much reference to the ideas of others should you make? How much to your own? Then, what sort of writing style should you adopt? Simple or complex? What sort of language? Big words or short words? How should you balance narrative with analysis? Do you need to have analysis in every paragraph you write? Should each chapter have its own introduction and conclusion, or should you restrict that sort of idea just to the introduction at the very beginning of the thesis and the conclusion at the very end? How many footnotes should you have? Is there a guideline, 3 per page, maximum 10 per page, something like that? Should footnotes be references only, or should they contain substantive points? Text which is, say, useful but not directly relevant to the points you're making in the body of the work. Another two left. Should you quote everyone on a point that backs you up? And finally, are the footnotes there to show you've read everyone on a subject, or to back you up on a point with the weight of your citations? Okay, so those are the questions. I found them very, very helpful because they actually reminded me of when I was writing a thesis, and when you're many years on from that, you forget some of that these are some of the thoughts that you're having. Right. Well, so I've said that I think, broadly speaking, with one or two caveats, the answer to all of these questions is pretty much the same, or reduces to the same. So the first question: how do you determine the structure of a thesis? Well, the answer I would give is basically to reflect on what the term thesis itself means. So, what is a thesis, right? A thesis is something that you've got to have. You are offering one. It's what you are offering up to the academic world, to the world of letters, so to speak. Your thesis. No one else's, it's your thesis, and there's something distinctive about your thesis, and on the basis of that thesis, you will be given the recognition of the qualification of the doctorate, which is a very high form of academic qualification, of course. So you've got to have a thesis. Well, what is one of those? Well, as far as I understand it, it's essentially a proposition. It's a proposition that you are putting forward. It's an interesting proposition. It's going to need to be, it's going to have something presumably controversial about it, some degree of controversy about it. I'm just to make the point, if I'm going to say, well, my thesis is, my name is John Stanton-ife, I've got red hair, a lot less than I used to have, or something of that. Now, these propositions are all clearly true, but they're not really very interesting. So, I mean, you could produce a proposition at the centre of your thesis, which is entirely correct, but just very dull, because, so what? Or who disagrees with that? Or something of that sort. Isn't that obvious? Okay, so first aspect of the thesis is that it's probably going to have some measure of controversy about it. Something has got to make it interesting. Perhaps something that's going to make it novel, or something that shows that there's an interesting combination of two familiar ideas that others haven't put together before, or something of that sort. But the main idea is there's got to be something like a proposition. The way I find it the most useful to think about that is it should be something that you could just write on the back of a postcard, right? So a little postcard at the back, my thesis is. You should be able to do that exercise. In fact, sometimes when I have supervisees, I quite literally get them to do this exercise, come in to see me and say, well, what's your thesis? And if you just ask, everyone can talk about that, and they can often talk at very great length about that. But sometimes people say, well, I'm working on this area of the law, and there's this case which is a bit interesting, and that case too. And then I'm also looking at this other legal system where there's this body of case law, and I'm looking at this kind of theory. But then you keep trying to interject. Yes, but what's your thesis? All that sounds great, but what's your thesis? What's your claim? What are you actually arguing? What's the claim that you're making in this thesis? So,
John,
yeah.
Do you mean that you think you have to have a single idea or a single hypothesis? It's not enough to simply write about a subject. You think there has to be a single discernible idea which permeates the entirety of it?
That's very, very much how I understand it. I mean, it can be quite broad based, but so you say, well, what's the alternative? Somebody has just done a very nice analysis, as you might find in a textbook, for example, and analysis of a body of case law, and thrown out quite a lot of interesting points and interesting ideas. Somewhere in the conclusion, you are going to want to know, what's the idea here? What's the central idea? And the idea might involve a plurality. So you might say, there is no way of explaining this body of law on the basis of one idea alone. So you might say we need something like a disintegrated theory, because you can't reduce the whole of the law of culpability in English criminal law to the one idea of free choice, something like that. So a lot of people have suggested this, but it's impossible. To explain it, we need a series of, you have to bring in an idea of character, we have to bring in another idea, we have to bring in another idea. So the thesis could involve a plurality. My thesis is that this area can only be explained with a plurality of considerations, etc., etc., etc. But that's fine. I mean, that passes the picture, the postcard test, right? That's something you can write on the back of the postcard. My thesis is that this area of the law can only be captured through a plurality of ideas, including something of that sort, right? But because what the alternative sounds to me as if what you're offering is a narrative rather than a thesis. So that's something that very much is at home in a textbook treatment rather than as an argued thesis. So I suppose, as I understand the thesis, there's a proposition at the centre which could have a very wide range of content, and that must be supported by cogent argument. And essentially, the rest of the thesis is the cogent argument. It's what's giving support to that thesis.
Right? And the new argument, the recent argument, not the old chestnut.
Oh, an old chestnut's fine as long as you're finding a way of breathing some new life into it. Yeah, but yes, if you just come up with exactly the same support for old chestnut as the originators of the chestnut did, then yes, that wouldn't be sufficient. Yeah.
If you've got a central idea, a central thesis, and the work that you're doing doesn't seem to be showing, what's your advice there? Do you change the thesis, or do you just write it and conclude that although that was the initial idea, it isn't supported, and in fact something else is the case?
Yes, I think I like a lot how you answered your own question. It was so you start off with a hypothesis. You think this is going to work, and then you look in detail at the reality of the world or the case law. You find that it doesn't exactly fit. So what you're going to have to modify your thesis one way or the other. It's not at all. It's not something usually to worry about. It's something to just happily embrace it, because the thesis, that sounds to me, you're describing a thesis I'd quite like to read. Okay, so here's a very plausible sounding hypothesis. I'm going to try to establish it this way, that way, and that way. We're going to find, once we look at it, that this is not going to hold up. This is going to have to force us into a more complex analysis of the situation that doesn't reduce to that simple idea I thought could do it originally. So this is what's left of the simple idea. This is how we have to modify it. This is my conclusion. Here's how it is. Sounds to me like a very nice piece of work. So it's often not something. I think this is why I'm always try to encourage this as one progresses. So now what's the central thing? And it's going to evolve. It's going to change. I suppose that's another thing that comes out of the question. I mean, when I started my doctorate at the same time as 6 or 7 other people, and apart from one of us who gave up, everyone ended up defending. But only one of us ended up defending a thesis with even with very much of a connection with what they originally proposed. So I mean, this is a process. It's going. Most people are going to find an evolution as they progress. The first idea, they're going to decide, oh, that was a useful ladder that got me up to here, but now I'm going to kick this away and I'm moving more over here. But many people will stick with something like it, but almost nobody, in my experience, ends up producing the thesis they promised they would when they initially applied.
Sorry, go ahead.
So how far along in the process do you decide that, okay, I could still make those kind of changes, halfway through, and if you sort of find your research is taking you in a different direction, how far along do you go before you decide, okay, I'm just taking this question and trying to answer it that way? When the hinges stop, so to speak?
Yes, I mean, again, there's no hard and fast answer to that. I mean, generally, I understand the whole process as one in which you should be trying to combine the big picture with the details. I mean, as you put it earlier, you've laid out basically in your right at the beginning. This is what I'm doing, and these are the steps I'm taking, and now you're doing it, and this was one of Ronan's questions here was, should each chapter have its own introduction and conclusion? Formally having introduction and conclusion in each chapter. I mean, some people do that, but it might be overkill to do that formally. But I would suggest always, as one's going through the chapters, having an explanation as to where you've just been and where you're now going, and having shown, okay, I promised you. It's almost like the tourist guide. I mean, someone's going to show you round Athens. They say, well, first we're going to the Acropolis, and then we're going to the Parthenon, etc., etc. And then, as you're going through, wow, that was the Acropolis. You impressed, yes. Well, we've just seen the Acropolis. Now we're off to the Parthenon, etc. Like almost like that. This you're showing that you set up the tour at the beginning of the summary, and now you're showing we've been there, and I told you it was going to be good, didn't I? And that was great, wasn't it? Now look at this. So that's something analogous, really, in a thesis. So I mean, in many ways, then it's that thesis. What it is. The thesis will probably be evolving as you go along. And so it's not something that it's something that you're always negotiating with yourself, I would suggest, as you go through. But it's something always to keep an eye on. Keep an eye on it. How is it going? Am I needing to modify my central idea now as I progress, and so time and time again repairing back to what the central idea is? And if that's there as the disciplining idea of the whole project, and this is why I suggested earlier that this series of Ronan's questions are more or less all answered by that thought, as far as I see it. So, how much reference to the ideas of others should you make? How much to your own? Well, what do you need to establish your thesis, right? You might, and remember, it's your thesis again. It's not someone else's thesis. This is you personally, right? It's your argument. It's not anyone else's. But you'll often find you're going to use the ideas of others as a foil, right? So you may find it very useful to say, well, here's X's analysis, and X seems to get 2 or 3 things wrong, which suggests how we really ought to see this. Or X gets this. X writing in context A has a point that can really help us over here in context B, something of that sort. So you're in charge. It's your writing. It's your thesis, but you're using the work of other people. You might be disagreeing with it, or you may be endorsing it in a different context. or you may be endorsing it up to a point and not up to another point or something. But what absolutely, I think this will be obvious, won't it? What must be avoided is just narrative. Well, this is what X says, blah 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 blah. Right, and now Y is another writer we might want to think about. Y says this, blah blah blah, and then someone else has this idea, and etc. And that's just description. And that's narrative. That's description, and the reader of a PhD thesis is going to think, well, if I want to read these authors, I can go and read them myself. Thank you. I don't really need you just to tell me what they say. Okay, I can get their stuff myself. So
can I just ask a
yeah.
little bit of that, John? My subject is on legislative drafting and the rule of law, and as part of what I do, I said maybe you could call it the background or the context. So I say Raz said this on this particular aspect of the rule of law, and Bingham said this on this on the rule of law, and Fuller said this on the rule of law. I'm trying to keep that quite short, but I feel that if I don't mention those key writers in the subject, that I am exposing an ignorance of them.
Yeah. Okay. Why? I mean, those are big names, right? Ones I recognise. Yeah, but why are you using them?
I'm using to demonstrate the content of the rule of law. So I'm saying the rule of law has certain contents of it. There's certain elements of the rule of law, and I want to look at each element of the rule of law, and then from that distill certain principles. So I therefore have to demonstrate what those elements are. Right.
So and once you've distilled the principles, what do you do with them?
Well, the main part. So in each chapter, part one will generally deal with what is this element of the rule of law. So I'll say Bingham said this, and Raz said this, and Fuller said this, and I'll give like a short bit about what they all said that element of the rule of law was. And then part two of each chapter, I will say, therefore, from that, so Raz says that laws should be accessible. And that's basically what I say about Raz. And then in part two of the chapter, I say, what does accessibility mean? It means we can access the hard copy of the law and the soft copy of the law, and the law as it is amended, and the law as it is enforced. And I go on in great detail to assess what that actually means. But my starting point is Bingham and Fuller and Raz have said that law must be accessible.
Okay, but I mean, it seems like you can't cut that out early on and make much sense later on, right? So that justifies fully that if you've got. I mean, I guess the test is: could you take one of those writers out, and it would still have the same authority and still make as much sense what you're writing?
Yes, I could get rid of. I could just get rid of just have one and say Bingham says that law must be accessible, and then stop there, and this is my principles that I've derived from that. But
actually, I mean I don't know much about this, but I've got a vague idea. I have some knowledge of what those three say on this subject, and it's not the same. Yeah, they
Hart and Fuller.
Yes, they don't say. No, you're right. They don't say.
They contradict. There's contradictions. Yes. It's not just.
Yes, sometimes they overlap, and so in some respects they will say the same thing. So they all say that law must be accessible, but then as they develop that argument, some say one thing and some say another thing.
Yeah, I mean, Bingham thinks that the rule of law includes human rights, and Raz thinks it absolutely doesn't.
Yes,
right?
he has a substantive view of it that human rights are part of it. Raz thinks that. I don't want to give the detail, but Raz thinks that it's purely formal and there's no substance to it.
But I mean, it sounds to me that if you're centrally analysing the rule of law and you need that analysis to do the work of your thesis, yes, there you need to. I mean, these are fairly major figures. One of them's a major judge, and the two of them are absolute giant theorists, and they've all written on this, and they don't all agree. It sounds to me like you can't do without the analysis early on. It would be folly to take that out. But then if you found you found some guy in Bulgaria and no one's heard of him, and you're thinking, oh, this will be impressive. I'm going to sound really recondite if I come up with this. And so you spend about 25 to 25 pages describing this thing. I mean, it's all quite interesting and so on. Except it really adds, it's nothing you refer to again. It doesn't do any work for you later on. I mean, it's just going to, it's going to beg the question, what was that doing in there? And
if it's repeating something else that you've already said or someone else has already said, there's less point in including it, really.
Well, it's got to be helping your thesis. That's the bottom line, right? It's got to be doing some work for you, right?
If I was to mention that there's a controversy in this issue, I would definitely mention these 3 chapters because they reflect the controversy in the principle of the book. So you can't really avoid it. I want to prove that there's a controversy. Well, there is Hart saying one thing, importance of morality, and there is Fuller saying his 8 points. So there is example of controversy. Therefore, I'm able to say this is a controversial issue. First chapter of my book.
Yes, and by the sound of it, you want to distill. In some ways, you want to distill the stuff they all agree on and then build on it or something. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, yes.
But yeah, either way, you're going to need to do it, aren't you? You're going to need, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, what about you take the approach of maybe you want to emphasize the points that you're about to make later on? You lay out all the, call them authorities, just to lay emphasis. After laying the authorities, then you go about making your analysis of what they have all said. What about you to take that approach?
It depends a bit where that's going to take you.
No.
Right.
What I mean is, maybe not quite a controversy. Maybe you're bringing in maybe 3, 4, 5 authors, and maybe what they're saying, they're not saying anything that's contrary to each other. But you are bringing them out because you want to emphasize the points that you're trying to make. Could you also take that approach?
Well, there's emphasis and there's emphasis, right? You want to emphasize a point because it's important. So
and I bring
state
in
it clearly.
Authors that have said the same thing.
Yeah, well, so you state it clearly, and you might say, I find particularly helpful X's analysis or something, and then you may
No, but what if I find all of it important? All of what the analysis they made. What if I find all of them important?
Well, you've got to prove it. Just because you find it important, that's not yet enough. You've got to show it's important, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're simply just repeating yourself, right? Oh, X says this, and then we've made the point very nicely in about 5 pages.
Okay.
And now you spend another 5 pages saying that someone else has said exactly the same thing.
Not quite 5 pages. I mean, it's short, something short for each one of them.
I think maybe we should say, I don't know, it's sort of, you know how in some papers you have sort of mini literature reviews, sort of, at the start, especially when it's a new sort of idea to bring it in. So you're sort of saying, this topic of the rule of law is about this Y, Z, and I'm looking at some of the various approaches that have occurred in the past, or are these X, Y, and Z in a few pages, and then you go on to now start discussing the fundamental questions that you want to address. Does that make sense?
So yeah, I mean, I'd always want to suggest that the analysis needs to be disciplined by where it is you're trying to end up, right? I mean, if you end up talking about a lot of stuff that's going to have no bearing on what you then go on to argue, then I don't think that really ought to be there. I mean, it probably means it ought to be pared down. It could. I mean, it may depend what you're saying. I mean, for example, if you're trying to make the point that here's an assumption that everyone makes, right? Isn't this incredible? Everyone makes this assumption, and now, says who? Well, look at X, look at Y, look at Z, look at everyone you look at. They all make it. So, but there, your claim is everyone is saying this, right? And if that's where the emphasis lies, then yeah, you've got to prove it. And then you're going to need to keep on showing all this one, that one, and what about her too, etc., etc. But that depends on what exactly it is that you're claiming. I mean, I suppose partly coming to one of Roman's questions, well, this was to do with the footnote. Are the footnotes there to show you've read everyone on the subject, or to back you up on the point with weight of citation?
Because that's another question that comes up, because you probably, from what we're told, your examiner will want to know if you've read everyone that is relevant for what you're writing. So it's important you bring them in some way.
Well, I can tell you when you're reading it, if there's a very I mean, it becomes pretty clear if someone has done pretty comprehensive reading on a subject. It's generally not very hard to show that if in a nicely honed thesis, but it can be very, very cumbersome to have extremely lengthy footnotes with a whole series of citations of writing where it's not at all clear how this is helping the central thesis. So it's really a balancing act, I mean, as long as you're disciplining this by your central claim, then great. But it does it, often the skeptical question, the principle of inclusion. You should be guarding your space a bit. Do I let that in or not? Is that really helping me? Is that or is that weighing this down? Is this making this almost unreadable? Is it possible still to read this and make sense of this? There's so much citation here, and so it's a matter of a balance as I see it. And again, it's difficult to speak in the abstract about these issues because there's so many different possibilities could emerge.
I think one sort of practical way. I know exactly what you mean. If you want to, back up your argument by saying, "Look at everyone who agrees with me, I must be right." But I agree that I don't think you should just throw in extra people for the sake of it. One practical thing you can do is don't do the repetition. Don't say, "Look at all these 5 people who all say what I've said." But if you can find a way to make a reference to them at some point to demonstrate that you have read it, so don't say, Mr. A, B, C, D, E all say this, and spend a lot of time on that. Say, A says this, and then maybe later on, you might say, and also, but B says this slightly extra thing. So you're not repeating everything again, but you're just making a footnote reference to say, actually, I have read B as well, and I do know C and D and E, because I've got a small point somewhere that demonstrates that I have read them as well. I think it's kind of cheating a little bit, and you're kind of shoehorning in, but you want to have a cogent argument which isn't cluttered up with repetition, but you also want to demonstrate that you have read everything.
The other suggestion that I have heard, I've done a bit writing, is that the bibliography can include everything you've read, but not necessarily everything you refer to.
Yes. Oh, yes. Actually, excellent point. Yes. Yes. I thank you for that. In fact, I should have thought of that. Yes. I mean, yes. I can go back to your question. That's part of what I should have said to you. I mean, yes. If you put something in the bibliography, I mean, you are suggesting that you've looked at it, and so you should be a little bit careful about that, because if you really haven't, and the examiner takes it on himself or herself to ask you about that, say, I know you read that but didn't refer to it. So can you let me know why you decided not to refer to that in the, and if so, you need to know what they're talking about at that point. But yes, thank you. The bibliography is partly there to deal with that problem. It'll show that you've read the bibliography. Will suggest this is what I've examined for this thesis, which isn't necessarily everything that I've cited in the course of the work. But you do open yourself up to a question in your viva about why you read that but didn't mention it. Yes. So. Okay. So I probably don't need to go through all the separate questions, but I hope it's fairly clear to you the central suggestion I'm trying to make, which is about these variety of questions about what ought to go into the thesis, where and when and how much and so on. well, it should all be disciplined by that central thesis of yours. You know, what is the thesis? What's the claim? What's the cogent support that you're giving for it? And if you think about the examiner, the examiner is going to read this, is going to want to know what the thesis is. What's the thesis? How well is it supported? I mean, many institutions will make you fill out forms, and they'll have these questions. Well, did you find a clear and interesting thesis? And you're meant to say yes, no, and underneath explain, and you have to fill that in. And then, did you find cogent support for this thesis? Yes, no, explain. Lots of institutions will make the examiner do that sort of thing. So I think it's I hope helpful for you to keep that in mind when you're writing, that's what the examiner is probably going to be doing when they're looking at your work. There's going to be starting off like that. They're going to be looking for the thesis. What's the cogent support? And they're often on you may well be up. What was there? What did you find a lot of extraneous and irrelevant material in this thesis? You know, these are questions now that you are often quite explicitly asked to answer, and you've got to. And the computer makes you say yes or no and doesn't let you continue if you haven't answered. So that's the way a lot of this is going as far as the examiner is concerned. So it's I hope helpful for you to keep in mind that those are hoops that the examiners are going to be thinking of as they're reading through the project in general. But I suppose are there any more questions? Yes.
So roughly how many footnotes would you call okay? Is that possible to answer?
Well, I again want to give exactly the same answer as I've given to virtually everything else. I mean, does the footnote help your thesis or not? If it doesn't, it shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there for the sake of beautification, or another question Ronan asked was, well, should you develop long? What was it you said, Ronan? Should footnotes be references only, or should they contain substantial points, text which is useful but not directly relevant to the points you're making in the body of the work? I mean, again, without wanting to, I'm not sure that this is exactly the same as your question, but I'm generally against writing much in the footnotes. I mean, the footnotes should be there to refer. Occasionally, you might think, well, I might be misunderstood here, but I don't want to break up my narrative in order to explain this, because I may just be being overcautious. Maybe it's obvious to my reader I don't mean X, but what if they think I mean X? So then you might go to the footnote and explain, I don't mean X, of course. And then that might be a case where it's useful to write a little bit in the footnote, to ward off misunderstanding, but it's in such a way, just to protect yourself, to ward off the misunderstanding, but not in such a way that you don't want to interrupt the flow of your argument. It might be useful for something of that sort. I certainly wouldn't use it to say, I read something, and by goodness, this was a good and interesting argument, or I've got a really great counter-argument against this famous professor. It's not really relevant, but it's bloody good, So footnotes like that, and you see some like that. Well, those just shouldn't be there. I mean, if you've got an interesting argument against Professor X on some totally different subject, well, write the article somewhere else and get it published somewhere else, right? Sounds great. It's good news. This is not the only thing you're going to write. I remember being told that by my supervisor, actually, and it came as a great revelation to me. He said, this isn't the only thing you're ever going to write. You don't need to write that here. You could write that somewhere else. So it's again the point about disciplining your argument by your central thesis, whatever relevance to the central thesis. So I'm generally in favour of making footnotes earn their keep. I mean, obviously you absolutely mustn't plagiarise. So you're using someone's idea. You need to cite it, absolutely, of course, but that doesn't need any narrative. That just needs the citation and the page references and so on.
Two rules of thumbs of rule, two principles. No more than 1/3 of the page should be footnoted. That's the first one. The second one, I second the motion there. Not for the benefit of writing a footnote.
I think we're probably out of time. I'd like to thank John for a very interesting and good discussion about thesis. So we'll thank him for it.